Her eyes, umber brown, shining and thin, reflected brilliance, hinting at unrealized greatness. She allowed a small smile onto her lips at the thought of her eyes. They projected her presence and intellect, and made her more memorable, unforgettable.
When I first began to outline the novel, I'd always planned to have three main characters. This was because the structure that I wanted the narrative to follow, not necessarily because I wanted to juggle three main characters, because as a debut novelist, I found this to be pretty difficult as I went along, especially in the second phase when I had a lot of work to do to balance the characters out and as far as how I paced the narrative. But that's a topic for a different session. So this first character was always going to be a younger character because although Cereus Limnic is not a young adult novel, I feel like readers tend to have an easier time following younger characters because they generally are naive in how the world works, and the reader learns about the world of the story as the character learns, which makes for a more relatable character and thus a more relatable story. I think this is true no matter what the age the reader is. It's kind of a timeless feature of stories in general. This is partially why stories like Harry Potter are so popular for kids as well as adults, at least in my opinion. Kids dream about becoming wizards or witches or going to a magical school or something like that. And if they're honest, a lot of adults do too. So they get invested in Harry's and his friends' growth as people, wizards, witches, and they learn alongside him throughout the books. It's an effective formula, superbly executed throughout all the books and films. I'm personally a big fan of all the Harry Potter books. I read them actually when I was in college for the first time, and I saw most of the movies too, and I thought those were pretty good, just as a personal aside. So with that mentality, I created the first primary character of Cereus Limnic, Jinhua Ma. So at the beginning of the book, we find Jinhua, and she's 17 years old. She's living in a small, well, I shouldn't say small, it's more like a medium-sized town in Northern California. And she's living with her father. Pretty much typical teenage stuff, nothing really outstanding. So, what else can I say about it here? Of course, I don't want to spoil too much from the book, but I do want to give some context. So, she's a model student. She has friends. She lives a pretty normal existence, like I said. I think for her personality, she's a little bit competitive. She's a very logical thinker, and she's just curious about the world. She's one of those people who just has to know things, and if she doesn't know something, she it kind of makes her uneasy. So she's quietly going about her life, living her life, just doing her thing, and then all of a sudden, she goes to class one day, and this handsome boy shows up, and that's kind of the beginning of, it kind of piques her interest, and that's kind of the beginning of her story in the book. And this kind of unfolds a series of events that leads her to some pretty big revelations about herself, the way the world works, and then what it takes to survive within it. So was it hard writing from the perspective of an Asian American female teenager? Um, Honestly, it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be at the beginning. For starters, I've seen and experienced a lot of Asian culture in my life in general. So my bachelor's degree was a degree called Foreign Area Studies with a focus on Asia. So if you're not sure what that means, it pretty much means that it's a political science degree with a focus on Asia. That's what it was. So I studied the economics, I studied the history and culture of Asia in college, and I also got a minor in Japanese as well. Even though I haven't spoken it in quite a number of years, but yeah, the cultural knowledge obviously stuck with me. So during my undergrad and after my undergrad, I would end up living in Japan for a number of years while I was in the military, and then while I was there, I traveled to China just just for fun, just to check it out and see what it was like. And then later on, years after that, I traveled to Korea, and then later on Singapore, Malaysia, Myanmar. So yeah, I've traveled a lot throughout the region, so I know it pretty well. Not just the geography, but of course, just like the culture and the people, because that just fascinates me. I've always been into different languages and cultures. It's kind of a I don't know. I was always into geography and history as a kid, so anytime I can get an opportunity to see something up close and learn about it, I'm all for it. I mention all this to say that I know Asian culture pretty well, and I felt pretty confident that I could accurately depict a character with such a background in my novel. As far as writing from a female perspective in general, this was another thing that initially I thought it was going to be tough, but after a while, I didn't find it too hard. I think the most challenging part was constantly putting my male brain aside and reminding myself that females and women just tend to notice different things about people, the world, and themselves than men do. So you got to constantly remind yourself that when you're trying to write from that perspective and do it well, when doing it with a degree of accuracy. Some things I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. Women are just flat out better at doing. I think when it comes to the realm of emotions and states of mind, I think they just kind of have this kind of otherworldly ability to tap into and perceive those things better in general, of course, than men do. So almost every sentence that I would write, when it came to Jinhua or any other female character in the novel, I would stop and ask myself, how does Jinhua feel about what's happening to her at this moment? Or how does she feel about how other people around her feel at this moment? I think asking myself questions like this and and when I say continuously, I mean it was like continuously, reminding myself that while they may see the same things, girls and women focus on different things in general than boys and men do. That helped make writing all of the female characters in the book, including Jinhua, much easier for me. One aspect of writing that I really enjoyed writing was from the perspective of a teenager. You know, for all of her studiousness, discerning nature, curiosity, and just her logical state of mind, Jinhua, as a character, she couldn't come off as kind of this pseudo adult. I feel like that's the way a lot of teenagers kind of come off. It's like they want to be grown. I remember when I was a teenager, I always wanted to be grown. You know, I always wanted to act grown. And I wanted to sit with the grown folks and all that stuff. And but I wasn't. You know, you're still kind of a kid, but you know, you slowly mature through a process. But I really wanted to capture that for Jinhua's character because at the end of the day, she's still a teenager. You know, she's still 17, so she's got a lot to learn about, well, everything. And, you know, as most people over the age of, I'd say, 23 are aware of, Because let's be honest, even though, when somebody turns 19 and technically or 21, they're technically an adult, but they still, I know I did, still thought like a teenager kind of, it just takes you a while to kind of grow into that adult frame of mind where you're like, oh, I've got actual responsibilities and I can't just sit around playing video games all day. Um, but there's a special frame of mind, that mental space that teenagers occupy. It's the one that makes them rebellious or want to do or say stupid things, or feel like the only reality of the world is the one that exists in their heads. I had to make sure to insert this thought process into Jinhua's character. Otherwise, it really wouldn't make sense. At least I didn't think so. I think this was especially important for her because most of the other characters in the book are adults. It was important to make her think differently than all the other adult characters in the book do. Also, there's that teenage adult dynamic present in some of her scenes that can be at times awkward and at times frustrating for her and the other adults involved. So I wanted to make sure I captured that as well. I think as we get older, many of us forget what it's like to be that age, a teenager. Sure, we forget what it's like to be sure that we know ourselves, sure of our thoughts and beliefs of the world. We couldn't fathom that most of what we think we know about ourselves, our friends, or the world in general was just a convincing blend of our parents' belief, any media we've been exposed to, and the environment we've grown up in, or the community around us. Nah. That's why as a teacher right now, particularly as a high school teacher, it's helpful for my writing sometimes because it just reminds me of just how ignorant many teenagers are. Of no fault of their own, of course. Most just lack experience. And with time, they will mature and fashion their own identities and beliefs. Hopefully. When I look at some of my students, I think about myself when I was 13 or 14. And I think, was I that dumb too? And then I laugh. I'm like, of course not. Never me. No, I'm just playing. I definitely was. I wasn't. I don't think I was dumb in the sense of action. I don't remember doing too many risky or dumb things, but I remember just having this mentality that the world was a certain way, and it really was just. It's not that it was wrong, but it was just so limited. I remember thinking back to that time, and because I was going through some things when I was 16, 17, and I just, like any teenager, I dramatized the whole chain of events, and that became my worldview for years. And it took me a while to really learn that things didn't have to be that way. That it was kind of what I made it, not what was forced upon me. I think the internet has made what I call the teenage know-it-all effect that much more potent in the teenagers right now. And what I mean by the teenage know-it-all effect, you know what I mean. It's like, just like I was talking about with the way I saw things when I was a teenager, because today's teenagers, they got the internet to back them, they got that proof. Many of my current students, I think of them, they're born in 2005, 2006, the same year as the birth of Twitter and YouTube and Twitter, respectively. These platforms and others grew up beside these kids, forming the same bond as people from my generation have with early video game consoles like Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. Anyway, I think this is way different from generations of teenagers past who only had their community, parents, their church, and their friends to grow up on and take example from. Today's teenagers grew up with the world in their pocket and on display, and that makes these kids somewhat unique. The other day I was discussing internet security with one of my classes, and one of my students was shocked when I told him that phone companies like Verizon and T-Mobile can read his text messages and his memes that he sends to his friends at any time. He was truly shocked too. He was like, "Really? They do?" And I was like, "Wow." I was like, "This kid has a lot to learn about the way the world works." You know, if you're a teenager listening to you right now, just ignore everything I'm saying in this session. Trust, everything you're going through and experiencing now is important for you becoming the man or woman that you will be very soon. But ultimately, it won't matter as much as you think it will in the near future. I think it would have been helpful if somebody had said something like that to me when I was that age. Hopefully it helps some teenager out there to hear it right now.
Music for the Cereus Limnic podcast was provided by Ryan Fonger. For more information about Cereus Limnic, visit keithhayden.net and subscribe or follow @KH_author on Twitter. Subscribe or follow the Cereus Limnic podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.